Good evening all, very nice to be here at what I would have assumed was Warwick's, but apparently no, Warwick's. Which I know will linger in my mind as the shop of amazing mobiles and only secondarily books. I own two of these already actually. The elephant one, which hangs in my kid's bedroom, reminds me that there's a certain irony to being on an extended tour in which I pontificate about motherhood all over the world while my children go to bed without me at home. But anyway, I'm going to read just a short scene from Room because with this book I've been enjoying the Q&As so much that I feel it's best to leave a lot of time to hear what everybody else has to say about this book, because often people come to these events and they have more to say about it than I do. So it's more like a politician meeting their constituents, you know, it's fascinatingly interactive for me. Room is narrated by a 5-year-old called Jack, who, as far as he knows, his world is 11 foot by 11 foot square, and it's lined in cork, and he and his ma are the only people in it, and there's a skylight and a locked door. And when the book begins, he's just turning 5, and he's still under the impression that this is the size of the world, and that everything else, everything he sees on television, for instance, whether Dora the Explorer or President Obama, is all just fantasy. Now Jack's toys are mostly things like eggshells and cardboard boxes and vitamin bottles and toilet roll insides. But the great excitement at the start of the book from Jack's point of view is that the man who sometimes comes at night, who Jack knows only as Old Nick, has brought a Jeep, an actual remote controlled Jeep. And here's a little bit about that. Ma won't let me bring Jeep and remote into bed, even though they're my friends. And then she says they have to go up on shelf while I'm sleeping in wardrobe. Otherwise they'll poke you in the night, Jack, she says. No, they won't, Ma. They promise. Listen, Jack, let's put your Jeep away and then you can sleep with the remote because the remote is smaller, okay? As long as the antenna is right down. Deal? Deal, I say. When I'm in wardrobe going to sleep, we talk to the slats. God bless Jack, she says. And I say, God bless Ma and magic her rotted teeth all better. God bless Jeep and remote. Then Ma says, God bless books. We have 10. And I say, God bless everything here in Room and outer space and Jeep as well and remote. Ma? Yeah, she says. Where are we when we're asleep? I can hear her yawn. Right here, she says. But dreams. I wait and she doesn't say anything. Are dreams TV? She still doesn't answer. Do we go into TV for dreaming? No, Jack, she says. We're never anywhere but here. Her voice sounds a long way away. I lie curled up touching the switches of remote with my fingers. I whisper to them, can't you sleep, little switches? It's okay, you can have some. And I put them at my nipples and they take turns. I'm sort of asleep, but only nearly. And then beep, beep, that's door opening. I listen very hard. In comes the cold air. If I had my head out of wardrobe right now, there'd be door opening and I bet I could see right into the stars and the spaceships and the planets and the aliens zooming around in UFOs. I wish I could see that. Boom! That's door shutting. And Old Nick is telling Ma how there wasn't any of something and something else was a ridiculous price anyway. I wonder if he looked up on shelf and saw Jeep. Yeah, he brung Jeep for me for a birthday present, but he never played with him, I don't think. Old Nick won't know how Jeep suddenly goes when I switch remote on. Vroom! Ma and him only talk for a little bit tonight. Lamp goes off, click, and then Old Nick creaks bed. I count in ones sometimes instead of 5s, just for different. But I soon start losing count of the creaks, so I switch to 5s that go faster, and I count to 378. All quiet. I think Old Nick must be asleep. I wonder, does Ma switch off when Old Nick is off? Or does she stay awake waiting for him to be gone? Maybe they're both off and me on. That's weird. I could sit up and crawl out of wardrobe. They wouldn't even know. I could draw a picture of them in bed or something. I wonder, are they beside each other or on opposite sides? And then I have a terrible idea. What if he's having some? Would Ma let him have some, or would she say, no way, Jose, that's only for Jack? I think if old Nick had some from Ma, he might start getting realer. I want to jump up and scream, but I don't. I find Remote's on switch, and I make it green. Wouldn't it be funny if Remote's superpowers started Jeep's wheels spinning up there on shelf? Old Nick might wake up all surprised, haha. I try the forward switch. Nothing happens. Duh, I forgot to put up the antenna. I make the antenna all the way long, and I try again, but Remote still doesn't do anything. I poke his antenna through the slats of wardrobe. It's outside in room, and I'm inside in wardrobe all at the same time. I flick the switch, and I hear a tiny sound that must be Jeep's wheels coming alive up on shelf, and then smash! And old Nick roaring like I never heard him. Something about Jesus, but it wasn't baby Jesus that did it, it was me. Lamps on and lights banging in the slats of wardrobe at me. My eyes squeeze shut. I wriggle back and I pull blanket over my face. Old Nick is shouting. He's shouting, what are you trying to pull? And Ma sounds all wobbly. She says, what? Did you have a bad dream? I'm biting blanket, soft like grey bread in my mouth. Did you try something? His voice goes downer. 'Cause I told you before, it's on your head if... I was asleep. Ma's talking in a really squished, tiny voice. Please, look, it was the stupid Jeep that rolled off the shelf. I don't know why she says that, because Jeep is not a stupid. I'm sorry, Ma's saying. I'm so sorry. I should have put it somewhere it wouldn't fall. I'm really, totally... Okay, says old Nick. Look, let's turn the light off. Nah, he says. I'm done. Nobody of them says anything. I count in wardrobe. I count 1 hippopotamus, 2 hippopotamus, 3 hippopotamus. Beep, beep. That's door opening and shutting. Boom. That means he's gone. Lamp clicks off again. I feel around on the floor of wardrobe for my remote. I find a terrible thing. His antenna all short and sharp. It must have snapped off in the slats. Ma, I whisper. No answer. Ma, remote got broke. Go to sleep. Her voice is so hoarse and scary, I think it's not her. I count my teeth with my tongue 5 times. I get 20 every time, but I still have to do it again. None of my teeth hurt yet because they're not rotted, but they might be when I'm 6. I must be asleep, but I don't know it because then I wake up. And I'm still in wardrobe. It's all dark. Ma didn't bring me into bed yet. Why she didn't bring me into bed? I push the doors and I listen for her breath. I think she's asleep. She can't be mad with me in her sleep, can she? I crawl under duvet and I lie near Ma, not touching. There's all heat around her. Would you keep that there? So before somebody asks me whether Ma and Jack are in fact living on an island in the mid-Atlantic, no, it's just my Irish accent creeps in. I did actually try to learn an American accent for publicizing Room. I studied it very scientifically. I thought, I've got a few months, I can do this. So, I went on Wikipedia and I looked up all the pronunciation differences and I studied Standard American. And it was so hard. I got sort of halfway and then I just gave up because I realized there's even more to it than I had realized, and I perhaps don't have an actor's natural talents for it. So anyway, I apologize for them sounding Irish. On the audiobook version of Room, which is an amazing production, it's multi-voiced for people. The woman who plays Jack is so convincing that people think she's an actual child. In fact, my 3-year-old, when she hears me play the CD of Room in the car, she always says, "That's you when you were a little girl." She's somehow convinced that it's like a recording of me because it's my book. Well, I would love to answer any questions you might have about Room. Don't worry, if you don't have any, I can supply my own. Yeah.
How did you decide to make his language different?
How did I decide to make his language different? What the language Jack speaks in the book, interestingly, somebody out there put it through a piece of software which assesses the vocabulary level. and they reported that he speaks like a 7-year-old. I designed him to speak like a 5-year-old who's had a very unusual education, because I thought, you know, if all the time that my own kids are playing in a corner while I check my email, if I were instead talking to them, speaking very clearly, defining all my words and engaging them in constructive play, I think their vocabulary level would probably be bumped up a year or two. So I figured he's a regular bright kid. He's not a genius, he's not a child prodigy, but he's been very intensively homeschooled. But what's interesting is that there are certain aspects of a kid's language that you cannot speed up. I remember reading a very helpful bit about this in Penelope Leach's classic book, Babyhood, the book in the 70s. And she records a whole dialogue between a mother and a girl who's about 3 or 4. And the mother is saying the phrase correctly, and the daughter is just ignoring it and repeating it the way she did it. So I think kids have a sort of natural grammar of their own, and you really can't speed them past that. So that's why Jack has quite an elaborate vocabulary, but he still makes those classic mistakes. I was very lucky that my son was 5 when I was writing rules, so I followed him round, literally noting down not just things he said, but the category of grammatical mistake they fell into. So I would write down, you know, confusions about the past tense, you know, double negatives, double superlatives. I would say the most typical bit of child grammar is that they try to make the past tense regular. They'll say, I wind, I swimmed, and I love that one because it's like they're trying to make the house stand up. You know, they're trying to make something solid, and they don't realize the English language is a big old mess. So there's that sad moment when they give in and they start speaking like us. You know? So, of course, the language Jack speaks in the room, or rather, the language he speaks in the book, it's not quite like a real child speaks, but the language an adult speaks in a novel is not the way a real adult speaks either. In real life, we all speak very messily. If you ever, you know, record somebody and then write it down, it's just a shambles. And occasionally, very inexperienced journalists, if they're interviewing you, they think it's somehow more authentic to write down every word you say, and you sound like you're in some kind of, you know, drug which induces confusion. You know, sentences trail off in all directions, and I sometimes feel like saying to them, honestly, you're doing me a favor if you tidy up the sentences. It's cruelty to write down what I actually say. So yeah, oral speech and speech in a novel are different anyway. And in Jack's case, I figured his education has been strange enough that he would have more of an ability to narrate a story coherently than my son would, say. But one thing I really tried to hold on to was the 5-year-old psychology. So even if his language is fairly advanced, he still has that 5-year-old way of dealing with an abstract subject for a second or two and then immediately going right back to both the concrete world of what's for dinner, what happens when I flush, you know, what does my toy do, and also the way their fantasy is mixed in with their reality. I mean, they naturally segue from a discussion of how real life is to the most fanciful notions of superheroes. Yeah, even though my son is very different from Jack, because my son has had an upbringing out in the real world with lots of corrupting influences, I still try to locate in my son a certain kind of universal 5-year-old mind, you know. I think they at that age they are amazing they're both pragmatists and fantasists. There's a lot of fantasy, but it's sort of anchored to a very pragmatic problem-solving way of seeing the world, you know, and I love that about them. The one thing I never had any doubts about whether a 5-year-old would be a good enough narrator for this book. I mean, I think 5-year-olds have way more interesting minds than most adults, and I knew he would find a way to comment on everything, even if it took the reader a moment or two to figure out what he meant. You know?
Can you comment in the same vein on your choice to take away the articles from the nouns? And, I mean, that was very powerful in the book, obviously.
Yes, Jack uses articles for most nouns. It's just that any object that there's only one of in room has become a sort of friend to him. And the reason I included that was I really tried to think of Jack and Ma as kind of a little island civilization. You know, they are a culture of their own. They've built up their own little routines and ways of doing things and ways of talking about things. I never wanted them to come across as just kind of, you know, sad outcasts from our world. I liked the idea that, like, say, Robinson Crusoe and Man Friday, you know, they've built up their own little world. So just from looking at my own kids and the way they play with every object they encounter, and the way they talk to every object they encounter, and the way for them, a teddy bear is really as much of an individual and a character as their teacher at school is, I figured that Jack would make friends with all the objects around him so that he would have no sense of a lonely world. So I thought he's not only going to personify and give a capital letter to many of the objects in the room, but he's going to give them a gender as well, because I notice with my kids they never say it, every box or spoon is a he or she, and in fact, my son always claims that they are he, and my daughter always says, that's a girl spoon. So I just think kids are sort of natural animists, they see a spirit in everything, and they don't have our distinction between the world of individuals and beings and just objects. For kids, everything is alive. So I wanted to show that even though Jack has a fairly solid grasp of reality, he's not hallucinating or anything, but he naturally plays with and interacts with everything there is,
I think Ma did an amazing job of entertaining him and schooling him, and I think that it's so hard for a mother to just spend, a few hours keeping your child so entertained. But how did you come up with, she deserves Mother of the Year.
She does, but I have to start by saying I'm not Ma. Ma is the sum total of all the wisdom I have about how to parent, but I just can't do it like that, for more than 10 minutes. Often the first 10 minutes of each day is exquisite, it's like, here I am having fun with you at 5 a.m., and it's all so cuddly and spontaneous, and then they irritate me very quickly. And really, one reason I wrote Room was that I'd had those moments of feeling, I've been locked in this room for 7 years, when in fact I haven't, but parenthood does have those moments of claustrophobia, and it's a very odd state, because really one minute you're in heaven, the next minute you're in hell, or occasionally your child is in heaven because they want to be, playing Thomas the Tank Engine with you, and you're privately in hell and trying not to show it, And I notice parents do a lot of looking at their watch and going, oh, it's such fun here at the playground, but we must go soon because, your aunt is coming over. And you can tell that the parents are to a certain extent faking it, And of course, I think our parents' generation didn't feel the same obligation to have quality time, But nowadays, we have very high standards for ourselves. And so often there's this amazing intimacy to being in the little kind of inner circle of looking after your child. And there's also a suffocating quality to it. So I think that's why I was so seized by the premise of Room when it occurred to me first. Because I thought it's a very weird situation, but it actually captures something that all parents go through. And so I never saw it as a crime novel. I always saw it as a novel about the universals of parenthood and childhood, just kind of disguised as a kidnapping novel.
I was going to say, you've done an excellent job of portraying the stage of separation and individuation. So you don't know, his world and his mother's world are so blended, and it's a unique situation, obviously, because they're in the room. How he doesn't know where his mother ends and he begins, and then he has to adjust with that after their return to the world. But on what did you base that? Because it's so believable.
I'm so glad you like that, because I did a lot of thinking about that. And for instance, sure, the question was about how the book contains a lot about how Ma and Jack are sort of a unit, but then at times they're separated and individuated as well, especially in the second half of the book. I didn't want Jack to be, lacking in a real childhood. I know it might seem odd, but I really wanted Ma to be able to maintain some boundaries so he knows he's the kid, she's the adult. So she doesn't share all her worries with him. In fact, she denies a lot of her suffering so that he will feel able to carry on with playing rather than always worried about her. So I didn't want him to be one of these children who, you sometimes hear of, say, the children of a marriage where there's lots of alcohol or violence, that the children become sort of afraid to be children, afraid to cause any trouble. They become kind of weirdly, afraid of conflict. They're not able to just relax and play because they have to sort of look after their parents. And I never wanted Jack to have that quality. I wanted him to have certain kind of thick-skinned, 5-year-old getting on with the game quality. But of course he and Ma are so close that he does pick up on elements of what she's going through. And so I worked a lot on that idea of the times when they are you know, a unit, and the times when we see their realities sort of separate, because clearly Ma's going through something that Jack isn't. And in the second half of the book in particular, I think people are often quite surprised to find that the book doesn't end with the escape. But to me, it would have been a much more facile book if it was only the first half, because it would have implied that their only problem is that they're locked in. Where in fact I was trying to capture a more universal story of how everyone has to start growing past their parents. Everyone has to learn to cope without their parents at times, and everyone has to discover that mother does not know best, you know, that there are things the parents don't know, and there are ways in which, you know, you grow past them. So it makes them a more painful story. But yes, I definitely wanted to show Jack coping without Ma for at least a while in the second book, because I thought otherwise they'll always be locked in. I mean, they've had a very strange relationship, which made sense within the locked door of room, in that they're sort of like buddies, and they're sort of like a mother and a newborn. I mean, I tried to think of their relationship as healthy, but it's a funny combination, because they're never more than a few feet away from each other, so they are a bit like a mother and a baby. But in the second half of the book, I really wanted to show Jack setting off on that sort of journey towards adulthood. And for every parent, there's a certain relief in seeing your child start to grow up, and a certain pain in figuring they don't need you anymore. You know, just the other day I was at the playground with my daughter, and she was like, "Look, I climbed up the climber without your help." And you know, I was quite regretful, even though I'm sure I've had previous times of thinking, "Oh, does she always need my help up this particular climber?" But it's as if in a single moment you go from, "Why do I have to help?" to, "I want to help." You know? So my own mother, who she's there are 8 of us in my family, she's always described parenthood as sort of like releasing an arrow. You know, that your job is to launch your kids into the world, and your reward is to see them having their own lives. You know, that you shouldn't keep them bound to you or expect them to keep coming back and being grateful and taking care of you. It's much more like, you know, loosing an arrow. So I tried to give Ma some of that same sort of courage, you know. But one question you asked me was sort of how I came to that, and there are no real world examples of a situation like Ma and Jack. There have been hardly any cases where a long-term kidnapping led to children being raised within that, and really only the Fritzl case in Austria and the Dugard case in California that I'm aware of. And the Dugard case only happened after my book was written. So it was really a pure exercise in imagination for me. It's not based closely on the Fritzl case at all, because in that case there were all sorts of additional horrors, like bad ventilation, say. I mean, there were so many other miseries that family went through. So really, I gave Ma and Jack a kind of a best case scenario. So there are no real equivalents to them. So I just had to do a lot of sitting there thinking, what's it like for Jack at this moment, and what's it like for Ma? You know,
It was pleasant in a way. There was a pleasantness to it, despite the reality of it.
well, yeah, I tried to give their relationship an oddly healthy quality, considering how odd it is. You know.
Speaking of real life examples, on this evening's news, just before we came here, they announced that there was an attempted abduction of a UC San Diego student right outside of the library, just up the road here.
Really.
And it made me, and I was getting dressed to come here, and I was thinking, oh, this is a situation just like Ma had.
Yeah. I've got a niece at UC San Diego. I think there have probably always been such cases, but I think we are very, very interested in them nowadays. And I suspect, I mean, you could say it's part of the general interest in sort of telling the truth about, say, child sexual abuse, violence towards women in marriages. I mean, you could say it's all part of that phenomenon, but I think it's also that many of us nowadays are sort of stressed out from having too much freedom. I mean, if at any moment you can be in communication with anyone in the world by the internet, if you can fly anywhere, travel anywhere, you know, the possibilities get exhausting. And so I think people are oddly fascinated by the notion of how you could live in an incredibly confined way, and how you could find a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to keep going. So it's not just that these are narratives of endurance, it's specifically endurance of a very closed, small world, when most of us nowadays feel we're living in a very, very huge and interconnected world.
Did you have any particular initiative to write this story? In other words,
what you're trying to say in the book is much bigger and larger as you're describing it now than when you just read the story of the mother and son and Claude. Was there any particular incident that you thought, I need to tell this story?
Well, it was hearing about the Fritzl case that triggered the idea, yeah. But I almost immediately began planning ways to move my story away from that case. And not just so that the story would be in the realm of fiction rather than describing somebody's real life, but what I wanted to tell was a far less horrible story. I was so interested in the idea of not having your freedom. I mean, what if you had everything else except for your freedom? I was very interested in that. So I didn't want it to be a story of a mother and a child enduring horror upon horror upon horror. I deliberately made the circumstances far less horrendous so that I could test that notion of sort of how much do you need freedom, or if Ma and Jack have each other, at what point does she realize he needs other people as well, and it's actually worth risking his life to get him his freedom. And I think parents constantly ask themselves, from the first day of their children's lives on, the mixture of freedom and safety that they need changes. I mean, on day one they need all safety, but pretty soon any small baby wants to literally roll around and move its limbs. So depending on your child's age, you're constantly saying, oh, actually now maybe they should be allowed to do that alone. Maybe it's appropriate, maybe it's not. So I think parenthood is all about, do they need safety or do they need freedom? So I think, even though it was the Fritzl case that triggered Room for me, I think the reason the idea seized me was because of having two small kids.
You did a marvelous job on the reintegration and the psychiatric therapeutic treatment that they both went under. I'm a psychologist, and what kind of research did you?
I'm so glad you agree, because it seemed to me that I did a huge amount of research about the treatment. First of all, what they would be experiencing afterwards and the treatment they would be given. And then I thought, I can only report what Jack will report. So I had long sort of therapy scenes and I had to cut them out because, Jack would not be paying such close attention. And I thought it would really stick out if we had big wadges of medical language in there, which Jack wouldn't be likely to report. So it seemed to me I had to cut out almost all of it and literally just have snatches.
It wasn't necessary. So
I suppose the important thing is to get it right. For instance, I remember researching what are the procedures if you report a sexual assault. And in fact, I found that the rape collection kit they have to use, it involves, a 2-hour medical exam, literally over a huge piece of plastic to capture any DNA evidence. So, sometimes doing very thorough research, it actually gives you ideas for scenes, because I realized that, okay, if Ma's getting swabbed for 2 hours, she's not going to make Jack watch that, so he's going to have to be outside in the corridor. So one of the first moments when they're separated in the outside world is during the medical examination. So yeah, I sort of checked everything out, but then only put in the things that Jack would think to comment on. And of course, Ma's psychological state is a bit of a mystery to Jack. He's so distracted by the outside world, and so he might briefly overhear that she's on various medications, but he's not really saying, how's my mum doing? So then it comes as a big shock to many readers when Ma falls apart in the second half. But I really didn't want to gloss over how messed up she was likely to be, because I think if Ma had retained her kind of supermom status and recovered just fine, then the whole book could have been seen as, just using Ma's rape as a way to give Jack a very interesting childhood. So I didn't want to gloss over that. So even though Jack is not that aware of how damaged she is, I thought, to be absolutely fair to that character, I had to allow her to fall apart. Because I was ultimately more interested in telling the story of a very real person who, even though she might seem to have some almost superhuman heroic characteristics, she is ultimately flawed like all of us. I didn't want her to stay in the kind of fairy tale realm there. So the second half of the book shows, I think, both Jack and Ma as much more, human, because they can afford to be human now. They're no longer in Room. They're no longer sort of forced to act at that kind of hyper heroic level. They can almost relax into being more messy like the rest of us. But yes, I did a lot of looking up the websites of various clinics and seeing things like what other patients they were likely to be alongside, and the kind of ironies in some of the aspects of how they would be treated. That, for instance, from the doctor's point of view, the doctors want to give them nothing but protection and privacy, but of course you're your lawyer would be saying, let's do some media, So there'd be all these conflicting advisors and wanting different things of them and for them,
Well, just when you were saying that wanting Jack to have a childhood, I mean, if you think about the age at which she was abducted, I mean, that whole, your young adulthood. So, I mean, her whole 20s, and so she probably needed to recapture some experiences that she missed out on at a very important growth period for her as a young woman. And I mean, her maturity and cleverness is extraordinary for someone at her age. To think of all these different things to keep him occupied and give him values and all of that. That's quite extraordinary.
Yes, in a way I wanted to suggest that, in the context of giving birth in Room, Ma has had to get very mature fast, but you can't really skip life stages without a hankering remaining. So some people get really angry with Ma in the second half of the book. I remember somebody writing to me to say, how shallow can she be listening to her iPod when Jack is going through all that pain and confusion? But, I could just imagine, when somebody brings back the iPod with the songs you were listening to 7 years before, you would crave 20 minutes alone with it, I was trying to suggest that, in fact, her life gets far more complicated and in some ways much harder to live when she's on the outside, because it's easier to be just one thing. And in Room, she's a mother all the time, because if she's not defining herself as a mother, she'd be defining herself as a sex slave. So her way of wresting control of the meaning of her own life is to say, I'm a mother, everything I'm doing is for Jack. So on the outside, suddenly she's celebrity and a daughter and a mother and, a patient, and she's meant to be looking after all these different priorities. So I think it would be far more complicated.
So Jack saved her. She was a sex slave. She'd been kidnapped. She was in this horrible existence. And the arrival of Jack, saved her, because it changed the whole dynamic of her existence in the room. And that's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing to say about a child.
Yeah, one of the many forms of research I did was I read a lot of accounts on websites of people who've been conceived through rape. And occasionally you come across a very bitter story where somebody would say, my mother always resented me because I was conceived through her rape. But more often you got people saying, my mother always told me I was the one great thing that came out of that, So I think for somebody in Ma's situation, a baby would be a source of joy and meaning and power and selfhood. And in a way I tried to echo Ma's decision in how I put the book together, because I never wanted it to be the story of a fascinating, interesting psychopath. First of all, murder mysteries all have fascinating paedophile, rapist psychopaths in them, And I've read my share of those books too, and, we as a culture are absolutely intrigued by the image of the man who captures and dismembers women and children. We really are obsessed with that, and I didn't feel we needed another one. So I kept Old Nick at arm's length, and I wanted it to be, the story of Jack's childhood, just as Ma tries to sort of insist, Jack, you were having a childhood, that guy is not relevant, So even though I thought a lot about Old Nick and, I wanted him to be a very sort of solid and credible character, I limit him to just a few dialogue scenes, and in the second half of the book he's banished, because to have the book end with him in court would be to sort of say, oh, this book is all about Ma and him, but I really wanted the book to be all about Ma and Jack. So it was odd, because in terms of those decisions, I felt I was thinking very much like Ma, but in terms of planning the book, I had to think just like Old Nick. So this was really creepy. There I was virtually shopping for the furniture on IKEA.com, and I'm making exactly the same decisions as their captor. I'm going, well, no, I don't think you'll buy the most expensive one, maybe not the cheapest one either, maybe we'll go for the Strongstrap bed, So, and I was deciding how many books to give them. Would I give them any books? And in a sense, the author is always the sinister, controlling captor of her characters. I mean, we always, in a sense, put our characters in a limited space and then allow them certain resources for coping with whatever we throw at them. But I've never been in such an uncomfortable position that, my decisions as an author were exactly the same decisions as the psychopath in the book. And of course, you know, even though I wasn't writing scenes from his point of view, even just writing his dialogue or having to make decisions about things like how many books to give them, I was briefly inhabiting his point of view. So that was quite an uncomfortable exercise.
I was surprised to read afterwards that there had been some kind of controversy, that there were women saying that in the book you had her nursing him too long, and it just made me angry to sort of hear those things from them. So what did you think when you got that
It's funny,
response?
when I wrote the book, you know, when I was sort of planning Jack and Ma's relationship, I thought, well, obviously she'll nurse him. I mean, first of all, you know, you'd go for any reliable source of calories that you can give your baby, and then if it works out as a sort of comforting routine with your child, you'd hold on to it. You're not going to suddenly say, "You're 2 now, Jack, I must wean you," even though we are alone in this room. I mean, my sense of weaning my children was that you do it at the point where it seems to you that they're entering the social world. You know, so whether it's at, some women do it at 6 months and do it at 3 years, whatever. But it's because it starts to seem to you that really they're off in the social world, and so that phase of your life is ended. So for Ma and Jack, that only happens when he's 5 and he's escaped. So I didn't realise it was going to be controversial, because after all, you know, they're living such a weird life anyway. It's not like I'm saying, this is how you should raise your children. And I have a friend who nurses her kids till 5, so I'd seen it and I'd realised that it's a visual shock the first moment, and then you just get absolutely used to it. But my agent had a very young intern who read the book and who wrote to me like, "You must change this before publication." You know, she said she hadn't realised what the thing was that I was referring to. She hadn't noticed the breastfeeding till about page 150, and then she'd been repulsed. And she said it was going to wreck the book, so I had to cut it out. And I remember thinking, okay, I must keep this in, because clearly this is one of those things about motherhood that we officially approve of as a culture, but we impose severe limits. Everybody's got an idea of the moment at which other women should stop nursing their babies. So it's a very odd thing. It's like a great good thing up to a point. So I realised it's an example of the kind of outer limits of motherhood, and that motherhood is meant to be this amazing, powerful, heroic force, but it's not meant to be too physical. It's not meant to be too visceral. There are not meant to be fluids involved. So yeah, I thought, oh, I absolutely have to keep it in. And no, it's funny, like even the New York Times review, she got quite, you know, uncomfortable about the breastfeeding moments, when it seemed to me that I wrote them in a way which was not at all incestuous. I mean, this was never going to be a Blue Lagoon type story. I don't think there's anything remotely incestuous between Ma and Jack, but you know, a 16-year-old just emailed me the other day to say, why do they still have baths together? It's unnatural. And you know, that never occurred to me, you know. Context is all.
There's a lot about nourishment in there, a lot about mothering.
Yeah, and my own experience of breastfeeding is that if you keep it up, it's because it's working for both of you. You know, I mean, if you get that rush of relaxing hormones too, so I'm sure Ma could do with it too. But it's funny the things that people get angry about. I was doing a web chat for one. It's a big sort of mothering site in Britain, and all these women were so angry with the grandmother for failing to take Jack to see the dinosaurs. So we get extremely judgmental about other people's childcare, even in novels. Some people get very angry that Ma didn't cut Jack's hair. And the reason I have him have long hair is that I figure, you know, he's not in a world where he's dividing people into males and females. I mean, as far as he knows, there's him and Ma, and everybody else is fictional. So he wouldn't really think that way. So even though he's a fairly boy in his instincts, you know, I don't think he'd say, your hair is long, but mine must be short. And again, if they're not in a social setting, I can't imagine Ma saying, the time has come to cut your hair. So I wanted that to be one of those things that suddenly when he's on the outside, suddenly he's realizing, oh, this is a problem, but it was never a problem as long as they were still inside.
Why did you choose to hang Confession Sunrise on the wall?
Nobody's asked me about that one. I wanted them to have little bits and pieces of Western culture. So I figured they would hear the odd bit of classical music and pop music on the television, and I knew that Ma would be able to pass on to Jack lots of stories she knew and songs and so on. But I wanted a few artworks as well, so I thought it was plausible enough that you'd get some, you know, free with a packet of oatmeal. I definitely wanted one image of pain and suffering, that Ma would like and Jack wouldn't see the point of. So I put in Picasso's Guernica, and the picture that was most important to me to put in was the Leonardo cartoon, because I wanted to introduce Mary and Jesus as a visual image, because I knew that Jack would quite relate to the idea of the kind of powerful sacred mother and the hero child, you know. So I went for a Mary Jesus picture where John the Baptist is there as well, because I knew Jack would be like, oh, I want a cousin to play with. So then I thought, what other pictures should they have? And I suppose I just went for another very, very famous one that would be a sort of beautiful image to contrast with the Picasso Guernica one, but also maybe a little bit blurry, because I liked the idea that Jack wouldn't be absolutely clear how many figures are in the picture or exactly where they are, you know. But certainly I would say my primary choice in terms of pictures was the Leonardo cartoon, and the rest sort of secondary. In a way, I had such fun choosing the contents of Room, because people often think that writers hate to be confined, and that, you know, what we want is to be allowed to set a book over, you know, all of North America and Asia. But in fact, that's bewilderingly hard. It's way easier to write about a confined space with limited objects. I mean, I literally had lists of what objects are in Room, and I knew exactly the conditions of, you know, what time the light would come in, you know, and the fact that Jack would only ever see the full moon, he'd never see a quarter moon. So I knew the parameters of their world, so then I felt very free to write within that. It's just like the 17th century playwrights who talked about the unities of time, space and action. It's actually oddly freeing to your imagination to have a sort of single setting and single storyline, and above all single point of view, because then you can allow your character's mind to wander freely, and yet you know it'll still have focus.
Did you draw pictures of the room? Did you actually put together some of these toys and things that they put together?
I used a home design website because I had used one to design our own kitchen, and I realized they're very good for literally moving the bits of furniture around and trying different layouts. So yeah, I had a diagram, and I had actual, you know, measured pieces of furniture, so I knew like how big the table was and how light it was and that kind of thing. So that was one of those moments when I was having to plan just like old Nick, you know, like, okay, if we do folding chairs, then they will fit behind the clothes horse. I didn't draw pictures exactly, but I certainly did try things like blowing eggs, and it's surprisingly hard if you don't have the knack. I figure Jack is good at it, but I found I practically had to hack half the end of the egg off before I got all the liquid out. So yeah, I tried out a few things like that. The main thing I tried out physically was that I had drafted the scene already in which Ma rolls Jack up in the rug and he has to wriggle out, but I wasn't absolutely sure about how convincing it was, so I asked my son could I roll him up in the rug, because he already knew, you know, that Mum was writing about a bad guy who keeps a woman locked up in a shed. I mean, you don't need to mention sex to explain this story. 5-year-olds completely understand that there are supervillains and superheroes in the world, and that evil is arbitrary, and sometimes you just have to, you know, run away from it. So he understood, and in fact, I think he thought for the first time I was writing about something interesting. So I said to him, the boy in my story has to wriggle out of a rug, can we try that? And he was very game for it. So I rolled him up in this dusty old Persian rug, and it's actually extremely difficult to get out of a rug. There's a lot of friction in there. So he was just lying in there going, God, get out! And at that moment, the mother in me was overwhelmed by the writer in me. So I was not quick to unroll him. I kind of encouraged him. I even put my fingers in the end and sort of patted his and said, come on, try. And I gave him various suggestions, and he didn't cry or anything. I mean, I didn't push it that far, but let's just say my need to know as a writer was definitely pushing me on there. And so eventually he managed to sit up and wrench it open. So I went back immediately and rewrote the scene to make it harder, and to make Ma, she has to be quite a sort of stern, hag-like figure there, coaching him, making him try it over and over. So that was totally helpful. I owe my son a big share of the royalties for that. And the other crucial man in my life who helped with this was my brother-in-law, because, you know, I could barely change the light bulb. So I thought, okay, how am I going to make this converted shed convincing? And it has to be convincing, because if anybody out there is going, you could easily get out of Room this way, then it would wreck the story for them. So I asked my brother-in-law how he would turn a garden shed into an impregnable fortress. And he not only took me seriously, but he got really into it. And I remember him ringing me up and saying, Emma, your guy, this is how he always referred to old Nick, as if he was some friend of mine, your guy would build a whole layer of chain link fence in to the walls and the floor and the ceiling, And he also called me up and said, your guy has to make the girl use cloth diapers for the baby, because otherwise the neighbours will be suspicious if some bachelor is putting sacks of used Pampers out. So, he was now giving me information that was nothing to do with construction and DIY. He was just channeling his inner psychopath. And, he was immensely helpful. When I was agonizing over the escape and how it would work and how would Jack get out of the car, my brother-in-law said, a guy like that would have a pickup truck. So, he solved so many of my problems by looking into his potentially psychopathic heart. It's not just writers who enjoy getting into the minds of monsters, I think plenty of other people do too. But it was so helpful of him because, at that point, all the friends that I'd mentioned this book to were like, oh, that sick idea of Emma's, is she still working on that thing? And whereas Jeff was like getting down to the nuts and bolts of exactly how the keypad would work and so on.
How many years did it take you to write the book?
Well, this sounds very odd, but it was the easiest book I ever wrote. What takes time in writing a book is not making up the words, it's all those blind alleys, all those red herrings, I don't mean the deliberate red herrings, I mean the times when you realise that chapter I've just spent 2 months on, it's boring, we can do that chapter, and I didn't have any of those losings of my way with Room. The idea came terribly fast, all on one car journey, and really by the time I got where I was going and was finally able to stop the car, I knew who would narrate the book, exactly where the escape would fall and what the last scene was. That all came very fast. And I didn't have any, plot points that I changed. All I did was tinker with the details. Like one of the few things I changed was I had thought that old Nick wouldn't allow Ma to have scissors or knives. So early on in the draft, I had her biting raw meat into little pieces before cooking it. And then I thought, hang on, she's going to get some horrible illness. So, that's the kind of thing I rethought. And I dithered a little bit about things like whether they would have television, how many books they would have, but really just details. So I would say I researched it for a few months and then I drafted it in 6 months. And then maybe a few months of rewrites. But it's taking far longer to publicise than to write, which is very odd. Usually with books they have this long gestation period and a brief birth and then you never see them again, sort of thing. Whereas this one came very fast, and yet it seems to be hanging around, demanding my time for a long time. I'm not complaining, obviously. It's just that success is weirdly time-consuming. I have no idea. I've been doing this since my early 20s, and I've never, had a hit like this before. So it's very odd. It's it's a great sort of ego trip, but it's also it's also quite strange the way it continues to demand your attention.
So are you writing or have an idea for your next?
Yes, and luckily even before I published Room, I knew what my next book would be, so I haven't allowed my head to be turned by all this commercial success. I'm carrying straight on with what I was going to write about anyway, which is about a murder in San Francisco in the 1870s. I've been intrigued by this case for about 10 years now, and it's an unsolved hit. A woman was shot through a window, and I've just always wanted to try and tell that story, So I think it's very good that I'm not writing anything remotely like Room, because we've all seen in a bookshop, something by an author we recognise, and we turn it over and we go, that's weirdly like the one that was a big hit 2 years ago. So I think it's very common for authors to try and sort of, chase and recapture that success. And in my experience, you can never tell what's going to sell anyway. I mean, my novel Slammerkin was incredibly slow and difficult to write and very hard to sell. All my publishers turned me down. Very, very hard to sell, and then it became a bestseller. So ever since then I've realised you cannot guess what's going to appeal to people, and if you try to, you'll actually be limiting yourself to some simulacrum of whatever was a hit last year. I find readers are very capable of picking up things that are difficult, depressing, a challenge to them one way or another. So I really try not to worry about what's likely to sell.
What does your father think of your career? I mean, you must be immensely proud
My father's, in many circles, far better known than I am. He's a famous literary critic. So it's a bit embarrassing showing your latest book to your father who's a literary critic, because you know that, you know, the books he really likes are by people like James Joyce and Cormac McCarthy. You know, his bar is quite high. And you just know that you're writing the kind of book that he wouldn't write essays on. But of course, because he's your father, he writes back going, "Oh, such a great work of literature, the most exquisite book ever." And it's really sweet, but you don't really believe all the praise, literally, you know. Whereas the rest of my family, I find it easier to believe because they're very blunt. They say things like, about this book, several of my siblings have said, "We had no idea you could write this well." I'm thinking, you know, the last 5 books I sent you, they didn't work for you, did they? I remember one of my early novels, when I sent it to my eldest sister, she wrote back saying, "Too many bodily fluids." So, yeah. The interesting thing is my mother didn't think my father would read this book, because she read it early on and loved it. And she said to me, "Your father, of course, won't read it, because it's in the voice of a 5-year-old, and he doesn't like children." You know, he had 8 of us. She still said that, you know, as a species, children did not appeal to him, and he'd never read a book set in the mind of a child. But I think because, you know, it was by me, he did read it. I don't think it's the kind of book he would have picked up if it wasn't written by his daughter. But what I love about people's responses to books is that they are so varied, in that it's as if everybody's reading a slightly different book. You know, some people read this and they come away profoundly disturbed and spooked and depressed, and other people, it seems, feel good to them from page 1. So I love that about fiction, that people take it away and read it privately, and they read it in the context of their own lives and whatever is going on for them then, and everyone reads a different book, you know. And some people write to me with theories, and, you know, I can't say that they're wrong. For instance, you know, the grandmother, somebody wrote to me and said, "I'm convinced that the grandmother in the book is a breast cancer survivor." She gave me about 4 points of why she thought this was. And I had to say, you know, I didn't intend her to be, but I'm not saying you're wrong, you know, because the book is not mine anymore, you know, it's out there, and everyone who interacts with it gets something of their own out of it, you know.
How do you feel about it being filmed?
Oh, I would love it to be filmed, but only if it's going to be a great film. So at the moment I feel like some 18th century lady guarding my virtue. You know, all these suitors come along and I go, no, not you, sir, not you. So my intention is to keep saying no until the right combination of great talent is lined up. I have written a screenplay, and I would love that to be part of the eventual film, but the most important thing to me is not for them to use my screenplay, it's for it to be a great film. So in particular I have 2 vivid fears about what kind of film it might become. I think it could become a really soppy, you know, woman devoting herself to her little son. "I love you, Ma!" You know, a very soppy film, which I would hate, because I deliberately never used the phrase "I love you" in this book. And I would hate it to become a sort of sordid, voyeuristic rape film. So, yeah, I'm fully prepared for it not to become a film, rather than that. And I know some writers say just take the money and run, but, you know, this is my baby, you know, and it has meant a lot to people as a book, and we've all had that moment of going to the cinema and seeing the absolute rubbish that a great book has turned into, and I don't want that to happen, so none in my name. But, you know, the film business is so difficult for writers. You really only have the power to say no. And as soon as you've said yes, no matter what it says in the contract about, oh, they will consult you, you know, your powers are already very limited at that point. So mostly I'm just saying no.
Any more questions? Well, thank you.
My
Thank you.